At 1:30, so time for me to open this afternoon's session into the examination of the island planning strategy. But I think everyone's been here before, haven't they? So I'd skip over the rest. Yeah, so this afternoon's session concerns itself with the spatial strategy. We've read the representations and the statements that have been made. There's no need to read out statements, as we've said before. So we're going to be considering this afternoon whether the spatial strategy is sound, which means it is justified, effective, positively prepared, and consistent with national policy. So when you're providing your comments, perhaps you can set out where you consider the plan is not justified or is not going to be effective, and tell us what needs to be changed to the plan and why. Are there any questions before we start as to how this works? No? Okay. Thank you. And we've met everyone before, so I don't think we need to do introductions again, do we? Okay, in which case I'll hand over to Mr. Spencer to take over.
Thank you, Mr. Steen. Welcome everybody this afternoon to this session. We're going to be looking at matter 3, which is the soundness of the spatial strategy contained within the island planning strategy. We've got, I think, Mr. Brewer, we've got to about 3:30, and is that a strict curfew?
That we're very strict.
Everybody's nodding, but that's
have full council this evening for the budget, so we've got to be hours sharpish at 3:30.
We'll need to bear that in mind. If we do run out of time in terms of the discussion, you'll probably have seen from the programme there are reserve time slots available, and it may be necessary that we have to use some of that to conclude the discussion. So in terms of matter 3 in the spatial strategy, I think we're primarily looking at policy G2 this afternoon, although that probably has some overlap with the housing policy H1 and E1 in terms of the distribution of development over the proposed plan period. And in terms of the spatial strategy that's put forward by the council in terms of the preferred option, or what the council considers to be the most appropriate strategy, is to use the existing settlement hierarchy. I'm assuming, Mr. Brewer, that's existing as in taken from the core strategy, and to kind of optimise development potential at those locations, primarily through infill and previously developed land, with a sort of I think it's pretty fair to say a sort of a more cautious or restrictive approach on development at edge of settlements compared to the current core strategy we discussed this morning, or touched upon policy SP1 of that document. If I can invite the council in relation to our MR Matters Issues question 3.1 to set out whether that's strategy, including retaining the settlement hierarchy as existing, is soundly based and is for the purpose of delivering the identified development needs over the plan period, an appropriate strategy in terms of the tests of soundness. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And a couple of parts of the answer, which I'll kick off very briefly and then pass over to my colleague, Mr. Mills. So just to confirm and reiterate what you said. So yes, the approach in G2 is effectively to use the assessment boundaries and focus plan growth within those assessment boundaries. I guess the key change in approach from SP1, which we also touched on this morning in the core strategy, is that accepted in principle development immediately adjacent to the assessment boundaries of the primary and secondary assessments, and then for rural service centres on brownfield land as well. So there is a change in that approach, but obviously, as we talked about this morning, this plan is also allocating land across a number of those settlements as well. In terms of the strategy, I guess, again, a starting point for the council is the level of growth that it's planning for within the IPS. And obviously we touched on that this morning, And so it's the spatial strategy to deliver that level of growth that's being planned for. I'm going to pass over to Mr. Mills now just to give a bit of flavour on terms of the options and the way we arrived at that and how we got through that.
Thank you, Mr. Brewer, sir. EA2, which is the IPS Integrated Sustainability Appraisal 2024, assessed different spatial strategy options and identified a best performing option, which is in effect then taken as the preferred option. Just for the avoidance of doubt and clarity for everyone, so the exact wording of that option is use existing settlement hierarchy, increase density site yield, focus on infill and brownfield, do not allow development beyond settlement boundaries. But that obviously did include extending the settlement boundaries where there were new allocations for them to be included within that boundary. How that was then developed is documented in HO17 evidence paper B. That takes that preferred option and looks to implement it, taking into account a number of factors, which included the key issues identified from previous IPS consultation, sustainability in terms of the most sustainable locations, which, as Mr. Long's previously referred to, was focused on transport and matters around that. And also the other infrastructure requirements and flood risk where it was a factor in certain larger sites. Thank you, sir.
And just pick up on that, Mr. Mills, in terms of just looking at the integrated sustainability appraisal. I think we were looking at table 4.2. You kind of set out 4 options. So this is somewhere within the sustainability appraisal. I think in previous discussions, we've kind of been directed back to kind of other versions to look at kind of reasonable alternatives. This is still within EA2. You're taking us through some of the alternative options in relation to the spatial strategies. Is that right?
That's exactly right, sir. So obviously the sustainability appraisal process evolved with the plan. So the original sustainability appraisal carried out in 2018 was for the plan proposed at that time, which was both for a different quantum and so a different range of growth options were looked at as well. But the actual the strategy that was then taken forward in the 2024 looked to then rationalise those spatial strategy options, but wasn't assessing quantum at that point. Yes, sir.
But you still have so within the latest integrated sustainability appraisal, you're still saying there's a kind of a pool of kind of potential options for a spatial strategy. The preferred approach, the one we want to do, which we think is the best performing in terms of meeting our objectives, is say that option 2. And I think it's helpful that you've kind of identified that, like it says, not beyond the settlement boundary. That does need to reflect there are amendments to the settlement boundary, presumably to include where relevant some greenfield sites.
Yes, sir. So there was a range of different options tested in that latest sustainability appraisal that included also the creating new communities. So it was a complete range, and also the existing settlement hierarchy, existing adopted plan approach. So in effect, boundary, hardline approach to settlement boundary off. Yes, sir.
Then as part of our MIQ 3.1, in terms of the strategy and what's presented in effectively policy G2, was around the kind of the settlement hierarchy, and the council's presented a rural sustainability matrix review, document GR3. Was that an exercise, either Mr. Brewer or Mr. Mills, to kind of look again at whether settlements that were identified as part of the core strategy still kind of performed that function and still had those kind of sustainability credentials?
Yes, so that's correct. That the document you referred to, the Rural Sustainability Matrix, focuses on those more rural settlements, so it doesn't take the primary settlements and the secondary settlements. It looks at those rural service centres and sustainable rural settlements that are lower down the hierarchy, and provides an overview and a kind of a review of the facilities and services within them, to provide an update on whether the council will consider them appropriate locations for growth. So that's the purpose of that document, is to effectively provide an update to those kind of lower tier settlements as to where they sit and some of the services and facilities within them.
So can I just add, I think just as a factual point, I think when you made your opening remark, you queried, is the settlement hierarchy taken from the core strategy? And the answer is yes, but it's not a mirror image. And just as an easy reference, you obviously got what's set out in G2, which is the proposed, sorry, I said, yes, the proposed settlement hierarchy there. In our matter 3 statement at page 9, we've set out as part of the response to question 3.7 what GS1, SP1 of the core strategy set out. And not only was the slightly different naming of the tiers, more particularly, some of the settlements have changed within the tiers. So although there are, it's still a tiered hierarchy, it's not a mirror image. So one just needs to be aware of that.
And for the council, so where things have potentially changed or don't mirror the core strategy, that is a consequence of factual changes if things have changed in terms of what a settlement can offer, or?
Yes, that's correct. And we've tried to look at population of those settlements as well as a key factor in determining, where they potentially sit within that hierarchy. Obviously, population alone isn't how you kind of do it. You have to look at the service facilities within it, but it does factor. So you're absolutely right. So the settlements that have just shifted around have been for a combination of factors relating to population, available services and facilities, albeit we certainly appreciate that is a bit like a housing trajectory, really. It can change by the day in terms of services and facilities that are available in settlement.
Indeed, probably has to be have to draw a line somewhere in plan making, so where you kind of take your evidence, understand, yeah. And then probably just allied to the discussion we're just having, I think that's point A of our agenda, but kind of probably flows over into part B, and I'm mindful this kind of has probably a significant degree of overlap where we were this morning in terms of whether or the role of larger sites in a spatial strategy and how options have been considered, particularly through the sustainability appraisal process. I think from what I'm understanding from looking at the integrated sustainability appraisal we discussed earlier, table 4.2, I think the council's saying that in relation to the kind of alternative strategies, I call them 3 and 4, which are kind of effectively a growth outside of existing settlements, or 4th sort of option of creating new settlements. They performed kind of from looking at the sustainability appraisal significantly worse than either options 1 or 2, which is the council's preferred option, or a reversion to the core strategy SP1 type approach. In terms of those kind of the reasonableness of that kind of that assessment, does the evidence, whether it's in sustainability appraisal or the evidence paper B, document HO17, provide that kind of persuasive evidence as to why that's not or should not be the preferred sort of strategy for the island.
Again, I'll again open up and probably pass over to Mr. Mills as well. And I think, I guess we have to remember the purpose of the sustainability appraisal and what it's appraising, which is the level of growth that's being planned for in the plan. And I think that's a fundamental point of this process. And that's what the ISA does, that supports the plan that we've submitted. It looks at the level of growth that we're planning for, and then assesses some of the options of how you could potentially deliver that on a spatial basis. And I think that's a worthwhile starting point. And I'll pass over to Mr. Mills. You may wish to add some further thoughts.
Yeah, so there's a thank you, James. There's a difference in terms of what's assessed for the spatial strategy versus the sites. The sites at the time of the appraisal undertaken, there was consideration about narrowing it down to those sites that would be required to deliver the spatial strategy, but the view was taken that that might limit the understanding of how other sites might necessarily perform in terms of overall sustainability. So actually, all the sites, I can't remember the exact, I think it's about 148 or 147 were assessed through the SA, and then it was by means of housing evidence paper B, so the development of the plan itself, but then that selection process happened. The sustainability appraisal didn't make a site selection, whether it was large sites or small sites. It just assessed them all in terms of their performance.
And then in terms of the effect, or what will sort of arise from the proposed settlement hierarchy in policy G2 and the distribution of growth, is it clear that through policy G2, in delivering the development that's identified in policies H1 and E1, how that will kind of be distributed around the island? Will it result in sustainable patterns of growth?
Thank you, sir. And I think there's a couple of areas in the plan to point to that try to set out perhaps that distribution of growth. So looking in Appendix 1, which got the list of large sites with planning permission, and that separates them by what were the old regeneration areas, just to give a flavour of where they're coming forward across the island, and shows the spread of those. And then obviously again, in Appendix 2, we do the same thing for the allocations. So we set out within those wider areas where those are coming forward. And I think, yeah, another point that's worthwhile making is, I think, is again something that we touched on this morning, really. And obviously there is a level of growth being planned for within the IPS, which is not the standard method. We touched on some of the potential harm that may arise from that. And I think the approach we've tried to take through this spatial strategy is to ensure that where that new development's coming forward is primarily in and around, well, certainly in those primary and secondary settlements. That's where the most services and facilities are. But importantly, I think also the likelihood is that the new development coming forward in those locations is going to be less attractive potentially to those people moving to the island who may be of a certain demographic, who present potentially one of the challenges we're facing when we're looking at kind of housing delivery and the people on the island and the demographics. So again, what we've tried to do is to kind of target effectively where the housing requirement is that we've got in the plan to the areas that we think are most appropriate. And that's why we've done that. So I think, again, what we're trying to do with this spatial strategy is kind of almost by default trying to address some of the issues that we're aware of through our position on the housing requirement. But again, we're trying to address them through other policies as well.
Thank you. And policy G2 talks about the focus for sustainable housing growth is within the settlement boundaries of the island's primary, secondary settlements and rural service centres. There's no distinction, no sort of implicit distinction that there would be different kind of scales of growth at those locations? Is that the council's intention, or is there through the allocations and other permissions, actually it does work out that there will be a greater proportion of growth in the primary settlements, distinct from the secondary, distinct from the rural service centres?
Yes, you're absolutely right. And in terms of the proportion, if you look across the primary settlements, then I think it's about 86% of the planned growth is coming forward in those primary settlements, and then roughly just under 10% in the secondary settlement. So again, going back to my previous point around where we're trying to focus that growth and why, that's a key part of the spatial strategy as well. And I think, you know, again, when we think about potential development coming forward outside of allocations, and we talked about windfall development this morning a bit, and we will do no doubt tomorrow and next week. That there are other policies in the plan that will work to kind of address, I guess, issues of proportion and scale in those particular locations. So when we think about design, exception sites, etc. So when we're kind of working down that settlement hierarchy, obviously the sites coming forward in those particular areas will be proportionate to the scale of that settlement.
Thank you. And in terms of the strategy that's set out in policy G2 and where settlements sit within that, obviously we've had various representations at regulation 19. In particular, when we asked this at our MIQ 3.6 and I think 3.7, whether Newport in particular fulfills a different type of role and should accommodate perhaps even a higher level of growth compared to other primary settlements, whether it be necessary for Soundness to kind of elevate it to a distinct kind of top tier. Like the council, I know you've addressed this in response to our MOQs, but
yeah, I say I think our response to 3.7 sets out our thoughts on that, and I think I'd probably just again reflect on the permissions and allocations that we've got, almost doing that anyway, and you know, our perspective is again the plan has to look forward a number of years, and so it may be that the focus is on Newport through current allocations and permissions in terms of the level, but that may shift during the plan period when we're thinking about other sites coming forward.
And then subsequently, in relation to, had a number of representations, I think concerned about the west of Wight being identified as a secondary settlement, and in turn the kind of distribution of growth to that location. I think effectively, is it potentially getting too much housing growth without commensurate employment land, and think about things like transport connectivity. So I guess is the west of Wight justified in being identified as a secondary settlement in policy G2?
Thank you, sir. And again, I'll refer to our response on 3.7, which sets out some of the detail on that. And again, just to add some further thoughts on that. And again, we've listed some of the services and facilities that are available. And when you look at the 4 secondary settlements, the West Wight is the largest in terms of population, just under 8,000 people, using the 2021 census data. And again, the amount of housing at 224 across the plan period, when you equate that per year, we feel is entirely proportionate to the size of that settlement and the facilities within it. In terms of its badging as a secondary settlement, again, it's the biggest one in terms of population, so we wouldn't expect it to fall down into rural service centre territory just because of the size of it and what's on offer there. And when you compare it to some of those rural service centres, it does have a distinctly different level of service and facilities to them.
Mindful Councillor Jarman, you previously identified yourself as representing the west of Wight in various capacities. Obviously, you've made the points yourself, and obviously others in the community have made similar submissions around the identification of where the west of Wight kind of fits or should appropriately fit within an overall strategy, and the amount of overall amount of development it could experience over the plan period. Is your feeling or your position one that it should be amended within the strategy to be identified as a rural service centre rather than a secondary settlement, or have another sort of role, a secondary, not somewhere else within the overall hierarchy?
I think most of the residents of the West Wight would regard themselves as being in a rural environment, which we undoubtedly are. People choose to live in that area because of its rural qualities. And, you know, we have the beautiful Eden Warren, we have the Downs, which are behind us, and we have a predominantly agricultural basis in the West Wight, and enjoy some tourism as a result of that. The concerns of our community related very strongly to a couple of very specific points. One was the settlement coalescence study, which is referred to in page 8 of my submission on R19. And that outlined the need to avoid coalescence of communities in order to preserve their rural qualities and their distinct natures. We've seen over the last 20 or 30 years in the West Wight an explosion of housing, well beyond the capacity, as I said earlier, of the sewage and water supply and others. And at the same time, we have fairly massive erosion of our coastline, all the way down from Fort Victoria and Linston Chine and Brambles through Totland, and indeed on the south coast as well. So as a peninsula on the island, we are in many ways quite unique. Whilst there are other rural settlements on the island, they don't exist on a peninsula like we do, with limited ways in and limited ways out. And that degree of development which has occurred has led to coalescence. Freshwater Green, Old Freshwater, New Village, Corwell, Totland, they're all coalesced now. And the villages which are outliers to that, Freshwater Bay is effectively joined in now with Freshwater. Middleton, still a little bit of separation, but the number of greenfield sites in between them is very few. And so to avoid further coalescence and to preserve some degree of unique identity within the local community, there was a community-led initiative to produce a neighbourhood plan. There was very wide community engagement in that. And the community and that neighbourhood plan seeks to preserve those distinct identities. It also, in our submissions, and I think this was echoed by the parish council and indeed by many residents, was the desire to very strongly maintain the development boundary where it is, effectively drawing a line to that coalescence and drawing a line to excessive development without any infrastructure to support the residents there, and certainly without any jobs. So that representation to preserve the development boundary without extension, and there was some confusion because people used the word development boundary in two ways. One was development boundary as is in the neighbourhood plan, and a revised development boundary which includes adjacent sites. So that was the first issue, which was around coalescence. The second particular concern that we had was that the expressed views of the community were that wherever we had those greenfield sites, which were in particular of a high degree of classification, and we had some of the very, very few sites on the island that were grade 2 agricultural land, which does have protective measures, then we wanted those sites in particular to be maintained and to be excluded from the plan. So those representations, I think, were made very forcibly over the last 4 years at least. And unfortunately, in the plan that you've got before you, have been ignored. Now, that's very unfortunate for our community. It's clearly against the neighbourhood plan. It's clearly against the coalescence study that was done. And it clearly voids much of the consideration about preserving local identity. Now, it would be wrong of me to focus only on the freshwater, although I'm a ward member from the West Wight. As a councillor, I have to represent, views of the whole island. And I think the importance of preserving rural community identities is something that should be recognised across the whole island. I think in the plan, by and large, for most communities, it has been. But for some reason, freshwater seems to have been unfairly targeted in this way. And I know some of those matters are before the planning authority at the moment. One of them recently was heard and rejected, which is in the plan you've got before you, for some of those reasons that I've outlined. But I think those are important considerations. They're important to the residents and to the well-being of the people within those communities and the maintenance of their identity. So I would ask that very strong consideration be given to looking at pulling those sites back out of this, agreeing to what Freshwater Neighbourhood Plan states, which is hardening of the existing boundary, and that we give due consideration to all of those valuable greenfield sites, particularly where they're of a high agricultural worth.
Thank you. Just so I'm clear, Councillor Jarman. So I understand the issue around the site allocations, and we'll have a separate we've got a separate session on that next week, specifically in relation to freshwater and Totland, and a more general discussion tomorrow around the site selection process. In terms of the spatial strategy and west of Wight being identified as a secondary settlement as a focus, just in the round for further sustainable housing growth, whether that's including development that's located within the settlement boundaries. Are you saying that's not an appropriate approach and it should be considered as further down the hierarchy as a sort of rural service centre?
I most assuredly do.
Okay. From the council's perspective, when you're looking at the kind of the strategy in G2, was account taken of kind of what's happened in various kind of locations, the amount of development that's occurred recently, and whether there's a kind of whether any settlements may have kind of benefited from an approach of there's an appropriate period now for a period of rest, let things potentially settle down before allocating or assigning or identifying it as further location for growth?
Yeah, I think absolutely that's always part of the consideration in plan making, in terms of when you're looking at where growth goes, you also have to consider where growth has been as well. You also have to take account of sites that are being promoted and sites that are available. That's obviously part of the conversation as well. But I think just to add some context, perhaps it's worth just setting out some of the numbers, and I've got a few more which I'll come back to you later. But in terms of the freshwater area, which is the designated neighbourhood plan area, so the number of completions over the last 8 years from sites of 10 or under is 47 units. So I'll leave people to consider whether that's an explosion of housing or not, at 5.9 a year over those years. And I think that's a part of the consideration when we're looking at where growth goes. Absolutely, as you said, so we have to look at what's already happened. And I think also, we get onto sites in terms of that. And I'll come back with a figure on terms of the sites in freshwater from larger sites with permission that have completed over the last few years as well. But generally, from a spatial strategy perspective, that there's often talk of fair shares and different bits of the island doing their bit and all that kind of conversation. But from a plan making perspective, the LPA has to kind of helicopter out from that a little bit. It has to look at the island as a whole. It has to consider where services and facilities are. It has to consider infrastructure. It has to consider a number of different factors when it's looking at where it's going to direct its growth to. And I think, from touching on a couple of the points that Councillor John made around the hard settlement boundary as well, that is the approach we're looking to take through GS2. So that is a change from SP1. So the assessment boundaries will become hard. So effectively anything in would be appropriate, everything out would not be appropriate. So there is a difference there. And again, we talked this morning a lot about certainty, both for the community and the development sector. And part of the reason for doing that is to try and provide some of that certainty. And you know, Councillor Jarman's alluded to the developments that occurred in freshwater, and the neighbourhood plan doesn't make any allocations, doesn't deal with the issue of housing at all in freshwater. So it therefore it falls to currently the core strategy and now the IPS to do that. And again, what we're trying to do through this process is to provide some certainty for the community through a hard settlement boundary, also accepting that a level of development will be necessary and is potentially available and being promoted in freshwater. And I think, you know, we're speaking about freshwater because that's the issue, but it plays out across other settlements as well. In that, you know, the services and facilities in these settlements need a critical mass to be maintained. And certainly when you look at some of the demographics we've got on the island, that's a really important point as well. And if the demographic mushroom in some of these areas is effectively doing that and has a really high proportion of people in the elder age bracket, then some of those facilities that potentially currently are there supporting potentially lower demographics may disappear. And so again, that's part of that thinking around where we're looking to direct growth. We've tried to take an approach which does a number of different things, provide some certainty, look across the island, consider where growth is, where it's happened, and where it potentially could come forward, and the approach we think is sound and effective.
Just two follow-up questions risen out of what you've just said there, Mr. Brewer. In terms of settlement boundaries as part of the this island planning strategy, have you reviewed those from the core strategy, not just in terms of whether proposed allocations or to encompass anything that's may have been permitted under SP1, but a more sort of general review process around consistency and ensuring that they're...
The short answer is yes. There has been that review process, and it's the largest proportion of work on the settlement boundaries has to effectively include those proposed allocations. But there are some, certainly in parts of Newport, where existing development, which potentially didn't fall within settlement boundaries, now built out, does now included within settlement boundary. Again, the thinking behind that is to try and provide some of that certainty to the communities within them, so they know where effectively that boundary sits.
Second part is, I appreciate policy G2 is described as priority locations for housing development and growth. Does it have wider applications when you sort of go through the plan in other parts of the plan in terms of the way that it's kind of set out? I mean, does it also follow that they are also priority locations for employment? The employment generally fits with G2 in terms of where new sites are, and then there's a further tangent to that. Does the definition or the sort of the assignment of settlements in G2 have any kind of implications, I don't know, for sort of service provision, service protection, or does it flow into other parts of the plan to kind of ensure that settlement hierarchy, or is it solely to serve a function around housing development?
I think by default, you know, if you're looking to locate the majority of housing growth within those settlement boundaries, then what comes with that housing growth, as Mr. Long quite rightly said, often is infrastructure. What also comes with that is critical mass sometimes in terms of population and people, and that then helps to support those services and facilities within those settlements. Obviously, that will always be proportionate to the size of the settlement and the population and the development coming forward. But absolutely, that's part of the approach is that by identifying these settlements and providing them boundaries and focusing growth in those areas, then all of those settlements will be able to benefit from the development that comes forward in them and the associated positives that come from development, whether that's new infrastructure, critical mass, or the issues that I've set out. And I've completely forgotten your first point. I do apologise. I've gone off on a tangent.
The first point was about kind of where, although this is described as a housing location, whether there's this consistency within, I appreciate the plan has to be read as a whole, but you've obviously got in policy E1 employment, and whether it kind of to some extent mirrors GS. Sorry, obsessed with this GS.
Yeah, I know, absolutely.
Main mod. I'm
You're
going
gonna rename it just
go
because.
to this policy rename. No, whether the employment kind of distribution of employment provision similarly mirrors what's in G2.
Give you the refresher, and apologies for my goldfish memory, but yes, effectively, we touched on this yesterday briefly, really, in terms of where those employment allocations / permissions are. They are located in these settlements, specifically the primary settlements in the main in terms of the employment. And again, that talks to the point I've already said around the focus for growth being in those key primary settlements, which is where we want to attract the new developments come forward, because of the implications that then has on potentially the people who occupy those homes and being able to access those employment opportunities as well.
Thank you for that. So long you've been patiently waiting for some time to come in on the conversation, and then I'll bring in Mr. Salmon shortly after. I think we're at the moment we're on sort of the generalities of the strategy,
for that.
and then we'll get on to kind of
It's difficult.
rural settlements and things further on. But
just going back to the matter we were discussing this morning in slight detail, was kind of, we're talking about the market take up of housing sites and the deliverability of them, you know, in readiness for nationals or smaller SMEs or equivalent, just in terms of kind of the developer hierarchy of how they see the island. I'd certainly agree that in terms of the primary settlements, the focus is in the northeast corner. That's where the most popular kind of more mass built area is, and that correlates to the employment allocation. So I'd say the council is correct in its approach with that. Once you start to get out of that northeast corner, if you are looking to build in a more volume scale, you definitely go West Wight in terms of the hierarchy of secondary settlements, primarily because land availability, access to ferry, access to services, etc., to take the West Wight and take it a tier down seems proportionally wrong compared to kind of the council's sustainability matrix, the rural sustainability matrix. It just doesn't feel like it fits in that spatial category at all. There are other things surrounding that. You know, I think Councillor Jarman is right. There are pockets of where there are identities of freshwater that create character zones for sure. But when you look at the neighbourhood plan, freshwater neighbourhood plan, for example, or the local green space audit, it defines the areas of open space of protection to define where these character zones are. Outside that, there is the settlement coalescence study, but the settlement coalescence study doesn't then say within these areas you're not going to develop at all. It just pays regard to the special character to give it an elevated material consideration. It doesn't say it's going to stop growth. It just encourages a better focus of attention to it about those core character areas. So, and against the backdrop, I think Mr. Brewer's right. The actual built deliverability of the West Wight and what it's contributed in development terms over the recent past hasn't been that great at all. I agree there's been allocations and there's things that have come forward and dropped out, applications that I've been involved with that are involving TRO applications, or, you know, that have fallen by the wayside. So it's been a difficult challenge, partly in politics, partly in kind of material consideration territory, but to change the status of freshwater, the West Wight, including the freshwater and Yarmouth categories, seems fundamentally incorrect. It feels like it's well placed in that secondary tier down. Just one point of granularity, I know we'll come on to it, just talking about the employment, if we could touch on at some point, was the correlation. We talked about it yesterday, the thresholds for employment land release and PDL supply. No doubt we're touching it, but the thresholds for 1,000 square metres protection versus the PDL against protection and against what is available in the windfall allocations. I think just, I'm not sure whether it's now to discuss that or whether we're going to discuss that a little bit later. Sure.
Park it for now and remind me to come back to that point. I'm sure you will. Mr. Salmon, please.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Really want to focus on the issue of the settlement boundary and the policies pertaining to the settlement boundary. Going back to the early 1990s with the new planning acts, the development plan process brought in the scheme to provide certainty and confidence to the development industry. I think obviously that moved forward proactively in most counts, I think through the UDP and even to some extent the core strategy here for the Isle of Wight. With regards to the latter, and I think it was mentioned this morning's discussion, I tried listening to the debate whilst driving the car this morning and managed to get hold of one or two little sound bites out of it. But I think it was a reference made to Mr. Hetherington's letter of 2011 with regards to the confidence he had in housing delivery, with the fact that flexibility is provided by SP1 of the core strategy and support and principle for development on appropriate land within or immediately adjacent to defined settlement boundaries. And obviously that reflected some level of confidence that could be achieved. Unfortunately, what we have in front of us now with the removal of that, I think we have a restrictive and probably what I believe is a reluctant plan. I think the local planning authority has reluctantly accepted to have to produce the local plan and reluctantly provided some level of delivery on a figure that I think is not reflective of actual need. And I think there are serious dangers of that set out in my statement. And I think that really is reflected in paragraph 710. And I apologise if this was referred to this morning, probably, but I missed. But 710 pertaining to policy H1, and it says in there that the council has taken a conservative approach of including 100 dwellings per annum from windfall sites, which represents 75% of the recent supply from these sites to provide a realistic and robust source of supply. Then it goes on saying, appreciating that windfall opportunities may reduce over time and also the more restrictive settlement boundary approach within this IPS. Well, to me, that really is an admission that actually this is putting the brakes on development and not actually proactively planning for meeting actual need. And on the issue of the positioning of settlement boundaries, yes, there have been tweakings, but I think as referred to by local planning authorities, these are more to reflect where existing development already is and not providing developable envelopes within which development can actually be achieved. I think the current core strategy approach is appropriate, where immediately within immediately adjacent to is acceptable. And I've sort of finish on the question is, why is one side of the road in a more sustainable location than the other side of the road? Leave it at the moment.
Thank you. Mr. Gentleman next, please.
Thanks very much. Well, Phil Salmon appears to have stolen most of my thunder on this, so I'll try and make it fairly brief. In terms of the priority for the settlements, I don't disagree with them, and I certainly agree with David's point about freshwater remaining in the section that it is. As a developer, I would view that freshwater could certainly take more volume in terms of house delivery than other settlements, and I think it's right that it's in the position that it's in as a consequence of that. However, I see, like Mr. Salmon, this particular policy is designed to limit and stop any kind of housing growth. I think obviously we've had some discussions this morning about the housing number and not too much on the allocations, but taking away the position that you can't, it's not appropriate to develop immediately next to a settlement boundary, I think is wrong. The most sustainable way to develop any community is immediately next to its development boundary. I personally believe that all settlements on the Isle of Wight, no matter how small, should be expanded to some degree.
every settlement on the Isle of Wight should be taking its fair share. And I don't think it's right that we should completely preclude areas from any level of expansion. In fact, I would go further and say that's abjectly wrong, because what you are then doing is you're expecting residents on the island that live in one settlement to see expansion, and residents that live in another to see absolutely zero. And that to me makes absolutely no sense at all. And, you know, it is the most sustainable approach to go back to allowing development immediately next to and adjacent to settlement boundaries. That is absolutely logical. And I do see that what we have before us as a plan, when we look at the number, and it's interesting when we were talking about the number this morning, or the quantum of development, and we look at policy G2, item 2, and it says clearly contribute to delivering the island's identified housing need. Well, crikey, we're not even dealing with our own housing need within this plan. So actually, well, that's a pretty pointless statement, isn't it? Because any form of development that was coming forward would be delivering toward a need, because abjectly, we're not even planning for the need that we have. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll come back to Councillor Jarman again.
Thank you. I heard a figure earlier, which I think was 47. I'm looking to check I didn't mishear it. So in one generation, our community has seen developments of, I'll list a few of them: Lanes End, the various blocks of flats around Stokes Green, on the Allen Bay Road, Summers Court, the very large West Bay development, Meadows Way, Small Horse Farm, Hook Close, Parkway, Red Lake, Millways, Heathfield Road, and 75 units alone at Green Meadows. If I add those together in my mind, I get a figure which is huge, and that's the explosion I was referring to earlier. So it is an explosion in one generation, completely out of proportion, I think, to many other areas on the island, certainly comparable with any rural community. I note the fact that there's a suggestion that areas should take something in proportion to their area, and I accept fully, and we're happy to do it, that our rural community in the West Wight should take something that's proportional. So if I look at the Isle of Wight being 140k people, and we're talking of, even at the high figure here we've got, which I don't think is deliverable, of 453, we're looking at basically at 4 per 1,000. So if that was proportional to the West Wight, and even if it is 8,000, proportional would be 4 times 8, 32 per year. Figure that's proposed is in excess of that. So we are trying to preserve here rural communities as separate identities, and the beauty of which that community represents. At the end of the day, our farming community is very precious. Our tourism industry, to us in the West Wight in particular, is essential. The walking and cycling that we bring to the West Wight and that is enjoyed as a benefit by the rest of the island is quite critical. If we were to lose that rural community through coalescence, through overdevelopment, many of those vital characteristics would be lost. And that's why we are putting up such a huge effort to make sure that our neighbourhood plan is respected and carried forward, and that the existing boundaries are hardened. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Just to come back to the council on certainly one of the points that's was raised in that exchange. We'll come on to rural settlements in the next sort of part of the agenda, but just thinking about some of the other locations, primary settlements, secondary settlements, and rural service centres. Obviously, there's an array of kind of allocations and permissions at those locations, and then it's kind of the settlement boundary then applies. The council's moving away. It's not the preferred option to continue kind of the SP1 approach from the core strategy. So outside of the settlement boundaries, at those kind of tiers of the hierarchy, just in broad terms, what could be the sort of potential options through other policies of the plan for further sustainable development that could contribute towards the 100 windfall figure? Presumably it's a positive approach if you're inside the settlement boundary, from the sort of the final sort of 4 parts of the policy. But in terms of some of the sort of potential flexibility some people might be looking at, how does the policy assist at the more sustainable locations?
Thank you, sir. And I guess this talks to the kind of paragraph in the middle of the policy, really, that sets out some of the other policies that provide opportunity for development to come forward outside of settlement boundaries. But just before we move into that, I think it is worth saying, again, from a windfall perspective, obviously a lot of that windfall development does already come forward within settlement boundaries. So when people think of windfall, they often think of it outside of settlement boundaries, but windfall development also comes forward within settlement boundaries as well, through conversions, changes of use, properties in gardens, all those kind of different ways that come forward. So I think it's just want to make that distinction that windfall isn't just outside, it's also inside as well, and we do see high levels of that on the island. But yeah, in terms of moving on to your point, so there are additional policies that would allow development to come forward outside of those settlement boundaries. So H4 that looks at infill opportunities, H7 looks at rural and first home exception sites, and then H9 around new housing on previously developed land. And so there are opportunities to bring forward sites outside of those settlement boundaries. I think, again, I'll come back to the point I made at the start, that the spatial strategy is looking to deliver the amount of growth that's being planned for in the plan. So that's effectively where we're at. Now, obviously, the plan's been written in a way that additional sites could come forward, and this G2 identifies where we would expect those sites to come forward to deliver development over and above the allocations in the plan if that did come forward. But notwithstanding that, again, there are those opportunities outside the assessment boundaries for stuff to come forward. And again, I go back to my earlier point of this afternoon, that when we're looking at the housing requirement we've got in the plan and what we're trying to do with it, and all the delivery aspects we ran through this morning, targeting that growth within those primary settlements near to those services and facilities will generate a type of property and people who will occupy those properties that potentially then talks to that issue around migration, which we know is an issue for the island and affects some of those rural communities. And we heard this morning again around second homes and second homes being potentially in some of these rural areas. And so again, if there's a danger that if too much development is effectively planned and coming forward in those perhaps more rural areas, then the occupiers and the purchase of those properties may not be effectively from where we've all talked about this morning in terms of the young people leaving the island and that kind of thing. It may not talk to that. So again, it's a bit like the housing requirement. There's complexities around this, which we've tried to steer a path through in plan making.
Thank you. And then we heard from, come back to Mr. Long in due course, but if we can just pick up the point from Mr. Gentleman about, I think probably in plan making, some of us might refer to as kind of more dispersed kind of strategy or approach. I think this gentleman was saying, well, so an option of kind of giving growth, proportional amount of growth to every settlement. I mean, looking at policy G2 and the number of settlements named in there, is there much? We appreciate we're not from the island, we have no connection to the island, we're impartial, but once you sieve out all of the named settlements in G2, is there much left in terms of identifiable settlements? Is it is it kind of reasonably generous in what it captures, or is there a particular issue on the island that sometimes settlements are potentially difficult to define, or sort of get into kind of hamlets rather than?
I think, yeah, obviously the further you go down the assessment hierarchy, the more challenging it is to effectively define what the kind of boundary of that settlement is. And I think that's reflected in the approach we've taken in the policy, where when you get down to that sustainable rural settlement level, that becomes more challenging. And there are some examples there where you've got some settlements which are quite close together but don't necessarily join up, and so then it becomes quite challenging. And again, when you look at the populations of those and the services and facilities within them, and again, you know, underpinning all of this is that requirement for sustainable development, and that has to be proportionate. And so absolutely, I take Mr. Jebson's point entirely that you know, everywhere on the island, whatever size of settlement it is, has the opportunity to effectively accommodate some level of growth to support that. And what we've tried to do in this policy and the policy's approach in the plan is to allow that proportionate growth to take place. But talking back to the fact that what we're trying to do here is deliver the amount of growth that we're trying to identify in the plan.
And I think, so it is worth keeping in mind the whole, in a sense, rationale for having a hierarchy and having some places expected to accommodate greater levels of growth than others is consistent with particularly paragraphs 108 and 109 of the MPPF in terms of sustainable access and sustainable movement. And you'll be familiar with paragraph 108, which sets out the objectives of a transport strategy, but then 109 says the planning system should actively manage patterns of growth in support of these objectives. And obviously you can have then a debate about what is the appropriate way of actively managing growth, but certainly a hierarchical approach, as in G2, we would say is an entirely sensible and well-established way of managing that growth, rather than simply saying, well, all places should all, as it were, put their shoulder to the wheel and all should accommodate. I say the approach that we've taken is that there are going to be, through those policies that apply outside of settlement boundaries, opportunities for even smaller settlements to accommodate some growth, but primarily it ought to be directed to the larger settlements, which tend to be the places with the greater level of services communities, and therefore the greatest ability for people to carry out their day-to-day lives using what's already there, rather than having to make journeys elsewhere.
Thank you. So, sorry to labour this point with the council, but just coming back to, obviously we want to get a plan in place that has a 5-year, at least a 5-year deliverable supply, plan-led system. In the scenario that you do get a windfall proposal, you know, not wishing you to be in the position of backing the presumption for sustainable development, but on this application of G2, there's no, if the scheme comes in for 100 houses in Brading, is that proportionate to that location? 150. Sometimes you kind of get plans that will kind of give a bit of a kind of a spatial steer on the amount of development or the scale of development that might be acceptable at a particular location. I just want to understand from the council, are you saying it's got to kind of look at other policies of the plan to help kind of inform that kind of proportional approach or assessment?
Yes, in a way, and in a way that the drawing of the assessment boundaries for each of those settlements in some ways dictates the scale of development that may come forward in. And I think it's towards the point that Sam made earlier. So yeah, you know, by definition, the areas that have assessment boundaries, you raise the example of Brading, obviously it has assessment boundary, and so a site coming forward within it is likely to be proportionate to that assessment in terms of size and scale. And I think just turning to your other point around, I guess, that situation where if we were in a position and we fast forwarded to that dreamy position with the plan adopted, and we then suddenly didn't have a 5-year housing land supply, we tried to address that through policy H1 and the back end of policy H1. So if we did get such an application coming forward, we've kind of set out how we then look at that. And again, we've mentioned there around being sustainably located to proximity to servicing facilities, and obviously the proposals are kind of, you know, addressing whatever that shortfall in 5-year housing and land supply is. So again, we've tried to kind of cover off and predict that particular scenario should it come forward.
Thank you for that reminder about policy H1. Thank you. Mr. Long, please.
Thank you, sir. I've touching on Mr. Bedford's approach. I mean, it's very common to have the hierarchy imposed in any local plan. You go across the country, there's always a hierarchy, in the kind of rural areas are the kind of last resort because they're the areas that are concentrating less growth. However, I think in this situation, it's interesting it's always a dilemma, isn't it, in planning, to go our most unsustainable areas, why are they unsustainable? And in a plan making positive process, should we be trying to make them more sustainable rather than keep the status quo and do nothing bar limited growth? That's always the catch-22. And then from a kind of third party objective point of view, if you're then making them sustainable, that then accommodates future growth in the latter years, which then seals its face to become higher up in the hierarchy. What do we do? Real challenge, that. But just in relation to the rural sustainability matrix, you know, there are areas where it does say, you know, we're weak because we don't have a shop or we don't have a school or a GP surgery or something. But as a positive dot, you know, why can't we change the status quo of sustainability to make them sustainable, but still in proportionate growth? I'm not saying that these areas are going to grow considerably, but there are certainly things that can be done to improve their sustainability in a proportionate and respectful way, which is touching on what Mr. Gentleman was saying. And indeed, I've always struggled. I think it's catch-22 again. We've got the sustainable rural settlements, but they kind of at the moment serve no purpose because you've only got the 4 policies there, but they're still outside the settlement boundary. So those policies exist irrespective of the sustainable rural settlements. It makes no difference because, for example, in the rural sustainability matrix, there are other smaller settlements that aren't identified in G2. They're still captured by the 4 policies outside the settlement boundaries. So in terms of hierarchy, what is the purpose of the sustainable rural settlement? If you're taking a more kind of sound approach, why wouldn't we include all the others as a sustainable rural settlement to make it clear? You either have it all or you don't, because why we're distinguishing the two. There's some other points I'll come on to in terms of the granularity of the specific policies, but I'll just park that for the moment.
Thank you. That's probably a nice way into sort of part D of the agenda in terms of the soundness of the approach to kind of rural service centres and sustainable rural settlements. But obviously pick this up at our questions 3.9 and 3.10. And we're sort of asking of the council whether that approach is justified. And in particular, in terms of helping to kind of meet the housing need, as we understand it, there's no allocations proposed at the rural service centre level.
That's correct. There are a number of permissions, those large sites with permission. It's covered off in our response to 3.10. So there are some permissions currently being built out or Place, Harrison, Bryston, Rookley, Nelson, Yarmouth, God's Hill, Wellow. So a number of those rural service centres do have a large site with planning permission in place, which will obviously help deliver some of the requirement that we're planning for in this plan. I think in terms of the general approach to rural service centres and sustainable rural settlements, say our answers to 3, 9, 10 and 11 kind of set that out. We've touched on some of that already in terms of their kind of role and place in the hierarchy, and also in terms of our thinking around the level of requirement we're planning for and where we're looking to focus that and some of the reasons behind that. So I won't rehearse those and go over them again. And I take Mr. Long's point absolutely in terms of sustainable rural settlements, but effectively when you read the policy as a whole, they don't necessarily have a purpose as such because they don't have a settlement boundary. However, I think certainly from an Isle of Wight perspective, you know, when we're looking at potential plan reviews, then you know, we may be in a situation where one of those sustainable rural settlements potentially has a couple of large exception sites come forward. That might potentially, could it then move up the hierarchy into rural service centre territory? So again, by kind of taking them out, I'll take the point in terms of the fact that they don't necessarily serve a purpose in terms of the policy, but I think in terms of that overall hierarchy point, and you know, as demonstrated not just here but in other parts of the country, having that kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, if you like, and whilst they are the bottom tier and don't have a difference to the wider rural area, it does then also provide a kind of stepping stone potentially for some of those if the services, facilities or scale of development within them increased.
So, I mean, there are, I think those settlements are identified on the key diagram by kind of black dots. You're saying, in effect, for the purpose of this policy, they have, can I say they have little kind of practical effect?
Absolutely, that's a fair statement. I say they are settlements, but I think you come back to the point you said earlier. They're very small when you go into some of the populations of them. You're below 1,000, some of them. So you know, in terms of the size of them, and that's why again historically they've kind of been named, if you like, but then not form part of the kind of priority locations for growth, which obviously is the similar approach we're taking here.
Thank you. Yeah. Just sort of thinking as we're sort of sitting here now, whether there is a kind of a separate spatial strategy policy. Rather than something that's specifically around housing development through G2. If these kind of other sustainable rural settlements may have other roles or other functions in terms of other policies, whether there's some confusion of kind of blending it in with policy G2 has no practical effect, whether that's the only sort of home for it in terms of part of the plan. Just taking a step back first, in terms of rural service centres, obviously these are part of the focus for sustainable housing growth. I think, as you say, Mr. Brewer, a number of those, they don't have allocations, but a number have. If you look at Appendix 1 of the plan, there are some sizable permissions at those locations. So it still comes back to the question, is it justified not to make kind of allocations at this level, including those settlements that don't have any kind of large extant permissions at Appendix 1? Thinking back to what we were saying earlier around 453, providing, you know, as a minimum scope some kind of diversity and options to kind of help ensure that that is a minimum. Was the rural service centre tier somewhere to look for some additional flexibility, or are there particular sustainability reasons or character reasons why that level of G2 has, some might argue, has not had a particularly sort of positive kind of assignment of growth through this plan?
think I'd probably reiterate the point I made earlier around the primary focus for the growth, the level of growth that we're planning for. And one of the reasons we're looking at targeting the secondary settlements is because the new don't come from those areas is likely to be attractive to potentially different occupiers than perhaps the more rural locations would be. So I think that plays a part in it when we're looking at potentially some of the harms we talked about this morning of not meeting the standard method in full. Again, you have to be then very careful around where you direct your growth to try and meet some of those wider issues that the island faces when it comes to affordable housing. Again, that's another aspect when we go back through the kind of the evidence base through the SHLAR and the ISA process. A number of the sites kind of promoted in these rural service centres were under 10 units. So again, when we think about that affordable housing, delivery of affordable housing, again, that forms a key part. Talks back to one of our key corporate priorities as well around delivering affordable housing. So I take the point, you know, we acknowledge that it could be seen that the approach to the service centres is not positive. However, I think we have to take that in context and balance with all the other things that the plan is trying to do, not least tackle with a really thorny issue around kind of housing delivery and level of housing delivery and how it can best manage that, whilst also looking to increase levels of affordable housing as well. So it's part of the balancing exercise, I think, that we've tried to put forward in the plan.
Thank you. And then we asked through sort of I think it's for our maths issues question 311 when we come down to sort of the further no, sorry, not through 311, but just the general issue around the then the subsequent sustainable rural settlements tier. So these are basically places that are positively not going to get an allocation. They then don't have a settlement boundary. So in general terms, they're not going to be a focus for further housing development, other than perhaps some very modest windfall, the intention through policy G2.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, yes, and then that, I think that picks out that middle paragraph, if you like, that splits the top three tiers, and then that kind of third tier, the fourth tier, sorry, the sustainable rural settlements. And again, for the reasons we've set out and policies that are listed there, there are opportunities, albeit restricted to infill opportunities, you know, rural first home exception sites, etc.
So the sustainable rural settlements do have settlement boundaries?
No, they do not. No.
But outside the defined settlement boundaries, including at sustainable rural settlements, subject to meeting a specific local need, which we may come back to, but obviously it won't be an infill opportunity outside a settlement boundary, or does the council read that and say that's different? You could have an infill at a sustainable rural settlement, although it might be some distance from an identified settlement boundary for a rural service centre or a primary settlement.
Yeah, policy H4 that looks at infill opportunities is specifically looking at those outside of settlement boundaries. So he's looking at those plots that might sit in between two existing properties and provide opportunity to take those forward.
And where we see in Appendix 1 of the plan, sites with planning permission, these are large sites again, but they appear to have happened at the sustainable rural settlement tier. Now, they may be anomalies or outliers. I'm looking at, there's a site in Wellow, Nettlestone and Seaview. They may be anomalies that you don't want me to go there, but
happy to go there. So the Wellow example is on brownfield land. So again, that would be effectively, if we were fast forwarding to that tree position, then that would be supported by policy H9. And the Nettlestone and Seaview one is slightly strange because a couple of those are kind of within the ride settlement, but they in the parish of Netherton and Steeview. So again, there's a bit of a nuance there, shall I say.
So I think you were going to say something, Mr. Bedford. No.
No, all I was going to say was that H4, when you look at it, in a sense, sets out its own criteria as how you would define whether something was an infill site, even though it sits outside of the settlement boundary. It's by reference to, in a sense, a spatial relationship just because of the built-up character of the area, but it doesn't need a settlement boundary to work as a policy because it's, say, focuses within itself on what it means by infill.
Thank you. So if I come back to others then in terms of part D of the agenda and the approach to rural settlements and housing, further housing development in particular in rural locations. I hear from Mr. Gentleman first and then Mr. Long.
Thank you. It's interesting when you're looking at the rural settlements and you're looking at the permissions in here. Part of my representation was that obviously this whole process had dragged on for some years and we are effectively in the plan process. So many of these permissions have in fact already been delivered. And what that means is that now when we're looking at those rural service centres, those permissions have been delivered or are in the process of being delivered. And actually there's quite clear scope in my mind that there's potential for further expansion there that's workable, sustainable, and a sensible approach to how we should be placing our development across the Isle of Wight. Giving some examples of that. There's a development scheme in God's Hill underway at the moment for 100 houses. There's no further expansion planned to God's Hill, but God's Hill, in my opinion, is in a good location to provide further housing. There was an application in Rookley, which has now been delivered. And again, Rookley is well placed to take some further scope. Both of these are at scale where they deliver on-site affordable housing. There's nothing planned in Knighton. I've developed a couple of sites in Knighton recently, and I certainly see there's more scope in Knighton. Knighton as a rural area has some great amenities. It's got a really good local shop. It's got a pharmacy. It's got a branch doctor's surgery, a couple of pubs, and a school with a preschool attached. These are exactly the sort of places that we should be looking to take their fair share of development across the island. Thank you. So just I think just on Mr. Brewer's point, the sustainable rural settlements, the settlements noted, they do feel, knowing them, like they are lower category to the rural service centres. The rural service centres, the settlements in there do feel bigger and more chunky, if that's the right word. They've just got more facilities and amenities about them. But what I was trying to say in a roundabout way in my last comments was that if it feels like sustainable rural settlements could grapple with more of a stronger policy definition about what it can be achieved beyond the scope of just being outside the settlement boundaries and those full policies. In terms of the 2018 Reg 18 allocations, some of these, I'm not sure back in the day whether they're called rural sustainable settlements or a different definition, but they definitely had allocations within them. And there's nothing environmentally changed about those parcels of land within the identified sustainable rural settlements. Why that still couldn't happen goes back to the points of this morning, to give certainty, particularly to, the plan recognises SMEs and windfall sites delivering 100 units, mainly from indigenous builder developers, to give that reassurance and comfort that there are smaller sites that are achievable. And, they will target different socioeconomic groups compared to some of the bigger places where we want our nationals to be encouraged. But even the plan, we shouldn't be shy of that, because the plan recognises, for example, that we do want aspirational houses for different types of targets. So we need that broad spread. And that, you know, we shouldn't be ashamed that rural areas in proportion, but we've still got the rural exemption sites that will still bring forward affordable style properties, but we'll also have properties that will be suitable for other demographics. So we shouldn't be nervous about that because it's about balanced supply across the island. But I personally would like to see sustainable rural settlements with a slightly different definition and stronger definition against just what would be more acceptable in terms of those 4 other policies noted above. It just gives a stronger sense of confidence.
Thank you. I mean, from the council's perspective, obviously we've got National Planning Policy Framework, paragraphs 82 and 83 of the December 2023 NPPF, in terms of looking at sustainable rural settlements, thinking about whether there's a positive role for those communities in terms of enhancing and sustaining the vitality of those communities. In terms of looking at these kind of tiers of the hierarchy in G2, are there any kind of settlements that kind of link to one another to kind of create a degree of kind of critical mass to support a further allocation? In terms of, we've discussed at previous sessions, obviously a strong need for affordable housing across the island, presumably through the approach for G2, a number of the rural service centres and sustainable rural settlements, affordable housing delivery presumably becomes to a large extent reliant on exception sites, whether that's a justified approach or whether there's an alternative through modest levels of allocation that could provide for social or economic benefits for rural communities on the island.
In brief summary, I think the policy H7, the rural first home exception sites would be the way that you would see affordable housing delivered in those areas. I think the scale of allocations, I think Mr. Long was referring to quite correctly when we look back to the 2018 plan, and as part of the approach in that plan, or in that draft plan, there were a number of small allocations in those areas. And I think I'll just reiterate the point that I made, and we've set out in 310 that when we're looking at one of the key issues on the island is delivery of affordable housing, and take the points and acknowledge around 82 and 83 the NPPF, but our position is that policies listed there, so H4, H7, H10, H6, and even H7 in terms of exception sites does allow a small amount of market housing to come forward as part of those to support it if needed. So there is the opportunity for some market housing to come forward in those areas alongside delivery of affordable housing, and I think that's the approach that we're looking to take, bearing in mind where we're at in terms of the housing requirement, the level of growth that we're planning for.
We'll look at affordable housing policies next week, about this time next week. So we'll come back to that under matter 7. Mr. Long?
Just have a look at the kind of effects and causes of the policies, if it was still relevant, if it still stands as written and gets adopted, some of the possible unintended consequences of the policies. So I may forget myself as jaunting along, but I'll try my best. So just from a kind of consistency point of view, for example, when we read G2 in relation to H1, which is the delivery arm of the plan, we talk about windfalls. When in H1 we talk about windfall sites, and they've got parts A to E, which correlate with the partly of the G2 policies outside settlement boundaries. H2 then H1, sorry, misses policy H10, self and custom built housing, which I presume needs to be integrated into H1 because it's still a windfall site in G2 terms. Does that make sense?
I'll invite the council. My reading of that to achieve the above is more than just the windfall. It's the totality of the 6,800. So the totality of the 6,803
Yes,
dwellings in policy H1,
Yeah,
not just windfall specifically.
your criterion B there, which obviously talks about allocating sites, to deliver housing, and then goes on to some of the windfall opportunities below that. So, sorry, I lost the point halfway through. It wasn't your fault though; it was entirely my fault. So, if you wouldn't mind repeating that.
What I don't understand is we've got, in terms of H1, Part C, D and E, the three policies. So we've got Part C is policy H4, which is infill. Part D, rural and exception sites, H7. And then we've got PDL on H9. But H1 then falls silent against the G2 policies, which the only one that's removed from H1 is H10, self and custom built housing.
Yep. So I understand. So yes,
Yeah.
H10 ought to be added to the list for H1.
It's probably just, we might as well integrate it in for consistency purposes rather than not. Again, it's one of those tricky debates in when you get a planning application. So just moving a step further in terms of actually H4, there's certain tests in H4 that aren't then manifest in the other windfall policies. The main one in H4 that I'm kind of drawn to is in paragraph 7.54, such gaps should not include agricultural land. But the other policies, H6, H7 and H10 don't have that material consideration. I don't know why then we're alienating H4 specifically from not using a particular land type. So effectively H10, H7 and H6, oh, sorry, just bar H9 because it's PDL, but the other categories you can use agricultural land, but H4 you can't. Now, I'd also, in practical reality, the small, for agricultural purposes, the infill policy, for the purposes of the size and extent, the availability of agricultural land mass between two houses is going to be completely inconsequential to agriculture. I just can't see any rationale for it being there. If you want a sensible deliverable supply of windfall sites, to put that extra tier of burden on, it's going to have an effect. And then my last point was on H9, housing on previously developed land. The consequences of policy E2 and the 0.1 hectare protection, right, 1,000 square metre protection, we could get into a position where we've got a piece of PDL that, you know, 1,000 square metres is fairly small. We're going to get into a policy debate about protection versus outside settlement boundary where we want to encourage PDL. If it stands, it stands, but there will be a, if one needs to prove viability in terms of E2, we're not, it's going to nullify the effect of H9 in this situation.
Could I just say that some of those points do seem to go slightly outside of the relevant objections that were put in the representations? I think it's like drafting points of consistency. That's fine in a sense because it's helpful to everybody if the plan is internally consistent. And whether Mr. Long had previously raised that point or not is in a sense neither here nor there, because the plan shouldn't be internally inconsistent. But some of those other points did seem to go to the merits of the wording and some of the policies dealing with wider issues. And I'm not sure I can see those points in the representation. So I've just put that out there so you can decide to what extent you want to explore some of those issues, because I don't think we covered those off in our responses, because in a sense they weren't aired in the initial representation.
Those points definitely in my representations. I'll let you read them at leisure. The reason I raised them is not about, you know, their word tweaks. I'm not having a stab at the reason for them, but I'm just, in terms of its macro scale, they will have real life practical issues of deliverability where we want to deliver these policies, but the practical reality, you know, and again, I accept Mr. Brewer's point, windfall sites can also happen inside settlement boundaries. They're not, this windfall isn't going to be covered by these 4 policies in isolation. I accept that. But there will be a proportion that are coming from here, but the other parts of the plan will have an effect on the overall supply. That's my point.
Thank you, Mr. Brewer.
I was just going to make a suggestion that I guess we've got a session, I think, next week on the housing policies, and obviously these fall into that. So given what's raised, and we'll take that away if that's an appropriate thing, and just have a think about it and potentially come back in that session next week, because they're the H policies, if that's an appropriate way forward.
I think there's probably, yes, we have got the housing policies next Wednesday, so maybe we'll pick it there. I think under the wider umbrella, and something that we'll have our sort of weather eye on, is if we accept the minimum 453 dwellings per annum that the council's obviously advocating as the sound approach, together with the proposed modification that's a minimum housing requirement, and it could be subject to sustainability, etc. That could be exceeded. It's just ensuring we accept the council's approach, treat this as definitely as a floor, that the policy framework then around that doesn't unduly cut across that or inhibit that perhaps occurring in practice. Yeah, we'll probably pick up the detail of that next week. Thank you. The other one thing I had in my notes, and I don't know if again it falls more into our discussion around the mechanics of some of these policies, is that there certainly were Regulation 19 representations around the use of the phrase "a specific local need" that comes into a number of these policies. Maybe again, that's something more for discussion next week.
Absolutely. I guess to inform that discussion next week, there is a glossary definition of that in the IPS, so that might be something we can touch on next week.
Okay. Is there anything further people wish to say or add in relation to the approach in policy G2 to rural service centres and sustainable rural settlements? The council's kind of not consideration, but just to kind of let the council know, obviously we will have to reflect on our sort of views, having heard the evidence, read the statements around policy G2. If we were to arrive at a conclusion for a more positive approach to rural service centres, certainly rural service centres, maybe other tiers of the settlement hierarchy. Does that effectively come under, would that arguably come under option 1 that the council's appraised in terms of sustainability appraisal, in terms of using the existing settlement hierarchy with allowing for growth outside or immediately adjacent to existing settlements? That was something that was permissible under the previous core strategy, so also the current core strategy that you're in a rural service centre location.
Yes, it is. There is a distinction in the core strategy and rural service centres around brownfield and non-brownfield land, but it does form part of the current settlement hierarchy in SB1 position. So that is something that we've picked up through sustainability appraisals.
There's nothing further than on rural settlements. I'm just mindful, we've got people around the table who haven't said anything so far to date on just the kind of general approach to kind of settlement, kind of hierarchy and where kind of settlements fit into the overall pattern and distribution of developments. I don't know, Ms. Baker, whether there's anything further you wanted to say in addition.
But I have written something very quickly. This is the omission in the spatial strategy. One of the first actions of the new government was to lift the ban on onshore wind generation, which is achieved by wind turbines. The island planning strategy is therefore out of date, not reflecting this change of government policy. One big omission in the spatial strategy of the island planning strategy is failure to allocate land for renewable energy, in particular wind turbines. The government recently stepped in with funding to save the Vesta wind turbine blades factory, with funding for half of its staff. The island with its land and coastal areas should be at the front of the queue for wind turbines. But despite the energy crisis, we see land allocated for possible huge energy consumption in the shape of data centres, possibly the site at EA6. Instead of a mix of renewable energy, the government keeps telling us it supports, but which must include wind turbines. And that's me. Okay.
Thank you very much. Mr. Brewer.
Yeah, happy just to jump in and thank you for that. And I think you're absolutely right. The recent changes to the NPPF are certainly more permissive when it comes to onshore wind. And whilst that might be a bit late for us in the plan making process in terms of considering any sites that may or may not have been, or haven't been promoted, but could be in the future for onshore wind, we do have policy C10 in the plan, which just does provide that in principle support for renewable energy schemes and low carbon technologies. So I think from a conformity with the NPPF perspective, we'd be comfortable that C10 does that. And obviously, if we are looking ahead to plan reviews and there are sites promoted for onshore wind, then obviously that we will give them due consideration through that process. Hopefully that answers the points that's been raised.
In addition, to note that this, obviously we're being tested against the December 2023 NPPF, which did not have that particular refinement to policy and obviously had its restrictive approach to that. So that also is relevant to the issue.
Thank you, and just check in with Bell Cornway. Okay. Thank you. So the final point for discussion this afternoon for we have to make way is around the role of neighbourhood plans. Picking up from Councillor Jarman earlier, we also MIQ 3.8. Obviously, there are 6 designated neighbourhood plan, sort of 6 designated neighbourhood areas that are known at this particular point. The National Planning Policy Framework says that strategic policies should set out a housing requirement for designated neighbourhood areas. And I guess our question is, does policy H1 do that? And if so, would it be justified and effective? Does it provide scope to make allocations through the neighbourhood plan process at those locations?
Thank you, sir. And yeah, we provided our response to this in 3.8, but just to pick up on some of the points in that. So there's a table in policy H1 which identifies each of the designated neighbourhood areas. And what we've tried to do, or what we have done in that table, is set out effectively the sources of housing supply within each of those designated neighbourhood areas. So some large sites with permission, some allocated sites, and then you'll see that kind of penultimate column of windfall. The number in there of 30, we've set out in our hearing statement. It considers basically the number of town, parish and community councils across the island, looks at the kind of the location of them and the size of them, and looks at the kind of windfall allowance and taking on board all the conversations we've already had and will continue to have on windfall. It applies a number of 30 to each of the designated neighbourhood areas across the whole plan period. So, which was at the time 15 years, so that would be 2 a year. And again, the information we've got in terms of the number of completions we have in those neighbourhood plan areas suggests that that number is entirely consistent when you look across each of them over the last 8 years. Benbridge, you've had 45, Brading, you've had 7, Brighton 23, Freshwater 47, Gurnard 29, and Neston CV 15, Yarmouth and Thornley 13. So that's only 8 years. Obviously, you've extended that out. You can see the windfall development that already happens in those areas is within the parameters set in the plan. I think in terms of then the role that neighbourhood plans could play, they would then potentially have a choice. So if any of those areas, or 2 of them, are looking to bring forward an emerging neighbourhood plan, the other 5 have them in existence. Neighbourhood plans would have both the ability to effectively say, we note H1 and the windfall allowance and will allow that to come forward, or they could be positive and make an allocation for that. So that a neighbourhood plan could pick up an element of that windfall and say we're going to make an allocation of 15, 10, whatever it is in the neighbourhood plan, will then obviously address some of the housing requirement identified in H1.
I see. So for a neighbourhood plan, it would be a choice out of that windfall 30. You wanted to, as you say, for example, have an allocation for 15. It would come out of that balance. You haven't gone further to say this is what the windfall we'd expect in these communities, plus we would allocate or expect to see an allocation for 30 houses in this particular location. No.
I think we're very aware that neighbourhood plans, some of them will deal with the issue of housing, some of them won't do. And equally, one of the fundamental purposes of those neighbourhood plans is to look in the real localised detail about potentially some of the land that may or might not be available in that particular area. So that's why we left it as a choice effectively for those neighbourhood plans, should they wish to.
And hopefully, a purpose of neighbourhood plans is to support further growth. I think they're envisaged to be a positive tool rather than something that's there to kind of further micromanage development.
Absolutely, and obviously, again, we come back to that point about what strategic policies are in the IPS, and any future neighbourhood plans coming forward obviously have to be in general conformity with those strategic policies. They can't go against them. So yeah, hopefully some of the similar themes that we're exploring through the IPS will then carry forward into housing policies. Should neighbourhood plans seek to have individual housing policies, they may choose not to. That's entirely their choice.
Thank you. There are no further contributions on matter 3 this afternoon. Can I thank everybody around the table for your contributions? We are now going to draw to a close for today. It's been a slightly long, a different day, starting slightly earlier, or certainly earlier for local plan examinations. So thank you for those who accommodated that this morning. We reconvene. I think we're back to normal at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. We'll start to pick up matter 6 and start to get into some of the detail of specific sites that are in the island planning strategy. Thank you. We'll now close for today.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.